Norway Chess is over, but I'm still going through a lot of the games, and there's one I'd really like to show you that somehow I missed in all the hurly-burly of the tournament. So it's Levon Aronian with white against Fabiano Caruana, and this is absolutely mad. I think you're really going to enjoy this. I think it was a great selection of players brought together by the tournament organisers, and Aronian really creative, and Caruana has shown, I think, particularly in the last few years, how he's prepared to really fight for the initiative, and he's a brilliant calculator. So let's take a look. Aronian with white. This is a classical game. So the time control was 40 moves in 2 hours, and then they got 10 seconds per move after 40 moves. C3 played by Aronian. Now D5 is a good response, challenging in the centre straight away. Here I quite like pawn takes pawn, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with queen takes. And very often this leads into an isolated queen's pawn position after black exchanges at some moment. You don't want to take too quickly, because that will leave the c3 square open and available for the knight to attack the queen. Aronian plays knight a3. You can play bishop e3 or bishop e2 there, but knight a3 is quite a trendy move. It's been played quite a lot. The knight sometimes goes to b5. Sometimes even bishop c4 is possible, or knight c4. Knight c6. And here knight b5 is the old move, but actually after queen d8, white doesn't really have anything. Bishop e3 is a little bit more unusual, but still quite a lot of games with this move as well. Pawn takes pawn. Now there's no point in going for an isolated queen pawn position with the knight here, and that would allow bishop b4 check. So knight b5, threatening the big check on c7. And here's actually quite an important moment. Queen d8 is okay, but queen d7 is a subtlety from Caruana. This is actually, there's a good point to this. Let me explain. So knight takes pawn on d4, and here Caruana played pawn to a6. So the idea is to be able to play bishop d6 and then queen c7, and that's quite an aggressive placement of black's pieces. If the queen had gone back to d8, then white would have been able to exchange and go into an endgame and actually damage black's pawn structure. So for example, in this position, after queen d8, knight takes pawn, and here a6 just isn't very good. You need to play a6 before you play bishop d6 and queen c7 because of the b5 square. But here white can simply exchange, and that's not a nice pawn structure. White has a nice initiative there. But with the queen on d7, that's different. This is the finesse. Here Caruana played a6. That's the move you want to play. So we want to play queen c7 and bishop d6. And here, if knight takes knight, then you just play queen takes knight, and there's no problem at all. If the queen is attacked by the knight, it'll just drop back to c7, and it's on a safe square. And you can see bishop b5 check has also been prevented with that little pawn move a6. So a6 has just been played. Bishop d3. Okay, that's the best diagonal for the bishop in these kind of positions. Bishop d6. It's interesting, both players actually setting up quite aggressively, not just white, but black as well. Here you can castle on the king side and then play queen c7. But Caruana played a really aggressive move. knight e7. It looks very odd to play like this. I mean, black's pieces at the moment look like they're treading on each other's toes. But this knight is going to swing to the king side, which blocks out that bishop, but also threatens sometimes to hop into f4 and to take the initiative. The compute is very interesting. It looks like a very strange move compared to castles. But interestingly, it's the move that the computer recommends, knight e7. So looking at this, I'm sure that Caruana was still in his home preparation and, well, he was making his moves very quickly. So yeah, it shows how very well prepared he is. This is not a main line that Aronian is playing, and yet Caruana still has a little idea up his sleeve. Castles now. Bishop g5. So you can see Aronian playing in a pretty standard way, attacking on this diagonal and potentially wanting to exchange on f6 to get rid of that knight. Knight g6 anyway. Very interesting that Caruana isn't afraid of this exchange on f6. Actually, you know, the knight packs out the king side, and these pawns are certainly not bad. Once that pawn advances to f5, that's a nice clump of pawns, and that f pawn controls e4, controls some important squares. Well, we're going to see something like that in the game, actually. Rook d1 from Aronian. Looks very sensible, putting the rook on the open file opposite the queen. Queen c7. Rook e1. So, well, Aronian's pieces look very nicely placed. Bishop d7. But it's difficult to make headway against this structure on the king side. 4 pawns in front of the king. And the knights as well. And soon, well, in fact, black might be able to get some pressure on the king side. You know, that's quite nice. The queen and bishop on this diagonal. And black may be able to use that f4 square for either the bishop or the knight. So g3 looks pretty normal to cover the f4 square. Now rook f e8. Sometimes it might be possible to advance that pawn. So it's something that white always has to watch out for. And if pawn to h4, I mean, I think that's the move that white would like to play, as we're going to see in a second. Then the knight can come to g4, and suddenly white's kingside looks a little bit sensitive. Got to watch out for a sacrifice there. So Aronian exchanges on f6, so already a really double-edged position. Black's kingside at the moment is reasonably secure. That knight defends the king. But the queen is quite a long way from the king. h4. Now, very coolly, my computer recommends rook d8 and then simply giving up that h-pawn. It's not fussed. And black hopes to gain the initiative with moves like f5, potentially the rook coming over here as well. Caruana instead played king h8. Well, also looks reasonable. On a good day, a rook may be able to come over here and start an attack on white's king. But first of all, you've got to deal with white's threats. If h5, actually knight e5 is very interesting, just giving up that pawn and then f5. Well, that didn't happen. Queen d2 played instead, so queen looking to get in on that weak h6 square. And again, my computer is very cool. Thinks black should just play rook d8. Now, that's not a very human move when you have that queen flying over to the king side. And I think very understandably, Caruana dropped the bishop back to f8. But actually, things are looking pretty good for white now. Knight e7, and now having got rid of that knight from g6, bishop c2. So white looking to just set up a nice battery on that diagonal. And once that move f5 is forced, then the e5 and g5 squares will be available for that knight. Now here Caruana played rook e d8, and the reason is he realizes he's going to have to play f5 at some point, and he needs to be able to defend f7 with that bishop. So that's why rook e d8 was played. Queen d3, threatening mate in 1. f5, and here, well, the game is really reaching its boiling point now. If knight e5, then bishop e8 is actually okay for black. It looks terrifying, but black can defend. Aronian played g4. In fact, knight g5 was the move here, threatening f7. And if king g8, then bishop b3, and you can see that everything is lining up on the e6 square, that rook as well, and actually a sacrifice sooner or later on one of these squares is going to be absolutely killing. So for example, queen b6 sort of defends there, but in this case knight f7 and then knight f5, and white is going to break through here. I mean, white's pieces are just tremendous. And if bishop e8, queen e2, so that steps out of this pin, and white is soon going to take on e6. It's incredibly powerful. Knight g5 was the move. Instead, Aronian played g4, which looks tempting to just bust open that diagonal. But Caruana was so cool here. f6. If white takes on f5, then e5 closes things, more or less. It's important that the rook is opposite the queen here, otherwise knight e6 will be very good, but we can just take that. So after f6, Aronian played g5. He still wants to get in on those dark squares. But now comes the counterattack, and Caruana had calculated this next phase of the game absolutely brilliantly. Queen f4. That just reminds white that his king is also exposed. G takes f6. Scary. Queen g4 check. King f1. Queen h3 check. If the king goes back, then, well, black has at least a draw. I mean, it could be possible to move that bishop and get the rook over. So king e2 is playing for a win. But white's king isn't that safe in the middle after knight d5. Watch out for a massive check on f4. So queen d2 covers f4. And here is a really remarkable move from Caruana. His calculation was sensational at this point. He spent 40 seconds over this next move, which shows that he'd actually discovered this, well, a few moves before, which is just brilliant. What would you play here with black? I'm going to have a little slurp of tea. You have a little think. Good stuff. If queen g4, then rook g1 is a strong move. And then it'll be white's turn to attack. Bishop b5 was played. Check. And after knight b5, then Caruana played queen g4. Wow, what is that about? Let's have a look. Once again, knight f4 is the threat. So queen g5, good move from Aronian. Knight f4 check. Now if the king goes back to f1, then queen takes knight. That's winning for black. So king e3 keeps hold of the knight. And now knight g2 check. The king came back. If black wants a draw, then you can just check again. But here is where Caruana played for a win. He played queen c4 check. Now we can see the point of playing bishop b5. It deflected the knight and allowed the queen to switch across. All played very quickly by Caruana. So now the king doesn't have a move. All these squares are covered. So you have to block. And now rook takes bishop. Incredible stuff. Well, here is where you need some time to figure things out. Quite understandably, Aronian just took the rook. He has an incredible move here. The best move here is knight e5, threatening mate in 1 and threatening the queen. Well, that's not a bad start. But somehow with these pieces here, it looks as though there's kind of mate in 1 for black. But remarkably, well, black does have a draw here, but he doesn't have a win, which at first glance, well, seems extraordinary. So for example, rook e3 check, king d2, and white survives. The best continuation for black is knight f4 check. The king goes back. Rook g3 check. Discovered check. Knight takes c4. Okay, you take the queen. Rook takes queen. Okay, we've got an endgame which is... Well, let me see. White is a pawn up. Well, knight b6. And now rook takes h5. Threatens mate in 1. The king steps back. Rook g5 check. And in fact, with best play, this is a draw by repetition. If the king tries to escape, for example, up the board like this, then it could easily fall into a mating net. Rook h3 and, well, potentially the rook coming over to g8 as well. But obviously rook h3 checkmate is the threat and white is in desperate trouble. So knight e5 should lead to a draw. It's an incredible position. But instead Aronian played rook takes d3. Knight f4 check. And here the best chance is just to give the queen. And this still isn't so clear actually. With best play, black should be better, but it's pretty random. But instead, after knight f4 check, king e3, and Aronian had obviously missed one of these moves because Caruana mopped up. And here, black is a piece up. f7 threatens mate in 1. Stay switched on. Queen g4. That was the final move. And black is winning this position. In fact, the king is pretty safe here. If the queens are exchanged, black's a piece up. And in the meantime, there's a big check threatened on d3 as well. So, I mean, really white has, as well as that knight as well, is under attack. So there really is nothing left for Aronian in this position. I think that's an indication of how brilliantly Caruana can calculate even in the most complicated positions. He is so cool. But what a brilliant fight from both players. They absolutely threw everything at the position. In fact, looking at the two players, Aronian eventually came third in the tournament and gained 14 ELO points. He's now number 6 in the world. So it was a great comeback for him. I'm delighted. Really like Levon. And in fact, Caruana, well, he only lost 5 points. Although he came 4th in the tournament, he only lost 5 rating points. So actually, I think it was just a really good for Caruana to get some more over the board experience. Keep himself in trim. He's got to think about the candidates, which, as I'm sure you know by now, has been pushed into the future. It's now going to be held in the spring. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.